A couple years ago, I wrote this program to try and measure network performance on a couple different internet providers from a couple different locations, and it turned out speed test is a way to do that. And I wrote a Python program, and that Python program basically just runs speed tests from different locations and uploads the data to Application Insights. So when I wrote that 3 years ago, it was OpenCensus, and Microsoft had announced at that time they were going to go to OpenTelemetry eventually, and eventually is pretty close at hand. So now I needed to migrate my app from OpenCensus to OpenTelemetry. So this is a terminate and run program. It basically launches from whatever site you're at, you run it, it goes out, runs the test, and then sends the data to Application Metrics as its operational and KPI dashboard, right? So when you use, it turns out this is super easy. The Microsoft folks did something really super easy to make this work in Application Insights, and there's only a few little gotchas, like it's hard to figure out where to get started. So in this case, I'm going to do the same thing, right? It's what's the latency to the server, what's the upload speed, what's the download speed, what's the closest server, those kinds of things. And that gives me a dashboard that looks like this, right? So I have ping times, and this is a single site you can see here. And I took this one yesterday, actually. And you can see there's some oddities at different times of the day. The performance looks different. Is it my network? Is it theirs? Don't really care right now. So what we're going to do is we are going to take this Python program, and we are going to figure out whether we're going to, how we're going to use OpenTelemetry with this, right? So basically, I'm using the OpenTelemetry App Insights and Azure Monitor as my observability platform, and the three pillars of that are metrics, traces, and logs, and OpenTelemetry supports that. You can either get custom telemetry you can get standard telemetry integrations where it will basically give you HTTP, and it'll do app to app, because it'll do tracing across boundaries, and you can do all this really cool stuff, and it'll auto-instrument regular libraries. In my case, I don't want any of the regular libraries instrumented because none of their data is interesting to me. What I wanted was custom metrics and tracing. I want to know, for a given request I did, what do the 5 meters look like, what do the 5 gauges look like, and if I did a run and it took 45 seconds to run, what percentage of the time was spent in each of the 5 phases? Get a server, ping, upload, download. Oh, there's a fifth and I can't remember it and don't care right now. So in my case, what I decided to do was use OpenTelemetry custom integration and disable the magic integrations. And for some other kind of app, you wouldn't do that. And then in my case, I wanted to use custom gauges for the ping, getting the server, getting the closest server, upload speed, download speed. Right? And then I was going to use the traces piece of that observability platform to get a feel for what the spans looked like for, when the program ran for 12 seconds, what part of the time was spent in which part of the app. And I'm not using logs in this case. So I'm using 2 of the legs of this. And the reason you got these letters up here at the top of this is because Microsoft actually calls these something different in App Insights. We call them custom metrics, traces, and logs. And in App Insights, they are custom metrics, dependencies, and traces. So everything actually goes into a log aggregator, but when you run the queries, you run them as custom metrics, dependencies, and traces, and they line up with metrics, traces, and logs. So if I'm just going to go through the code real quick, because people are always complaining there's no code or they want too much code. It always goes both ways. So I have this kind of function I wrote, register Azure Monitor, and this is almost my entire program that we're going to walk through. And it turns out Microsoft has the folks at in OpenTelemetry have a way for you to turn on and off certain standard automatic enablement, right, of the traces, logs, and the metrics. And in my case, I want to disable the log exporter, and I don't want to disable traces and metrics because I want to keep those. And it turns out the way you do that before you spin up the application and start doing stuff, you actually set a couple environment variables, and it turns out that the OpenTelemetry Python code picks those up and will, in my case, disables the logs exporter. So I only have traces and metrics being exported. I could disable them, and there's some numbers here on how many packets go back and forth. It turns out that there's the role name and the role instance name. And I had to go look these up, right? So the cloud role name in my case is going to be the program, and the role instance name is the host machine. So it turns out that the service name ends up showing up as the cloud role name. And in my case, I just pass in the name of the program. So all the metrics for the role name basically would be the application or the program, right? And then the role instance is the machine name. So then I can partition based on machine if I collect metrics on multiple machines. Wow, that was embarrassing. Okay, so here we set the cloud role, the service name, which will become the cloud role name, and that gets auto added to every packet. We're going to disable the logs. We're going to leave the the metrics and the traces enabled. And then I disabled all the automatic instrumentation. I did not want the URL package HTTP libraries to get instrumented, because it turns out when you run a download test, there's a whole bunch of packets involved and they all show up in the logs, and I didn't want that. Okay, so that's it. Configure Azure Monitor with your connection string. I don't want offline storage because my app is going to be gone by the time there's any recovery that happens, and I wanted traces and metrics enabled, right? And then basically what we do is we create a meter, and this is the only code that Microsoft specific code is this hot, quick, single command line to get the connectivity. Everything else is OpenTelemetry. So here we're going to get a meter, and then we're going to hang a bunch of gauges off those meters. So for everything I want to measure, I create a gauge on that meter, and they have a brand new gauge that is not a callback gauge, and that's the one I'm using. So I have 5 gauges. And then whenever we want to set a value on that, we just basically say gauge.set, and in this case, it's going to be the time it took us to get the servers in milliseconds. And I've got 5 gauges sitting on my meter, and whenever I make a call to speed test, I get 5 values back in the JSON, and I call gauge.set one time on each of those gauges. And then it turns out for tracing, it's almost as easy. So tracing, you can actually do nested tracing, so you can get spans, nested spans, right? And so what we do is we create a tracer, super complicated. This is actually also OpenTelemetry. Like I said, there's only one line of Microsoft code in this whole thing, and it totally rocks. And I don't know what happened here. I will look into this. And then basically we do set a current span. And then for each operation that I was going to do that I wanted a separate timer for, I created a span. So in this case, we've got a top level span and up to 5 internal spans. So if you were to look at this, you'll drill down on a trace, and you'll see a trace, and then you'll see 4 to 5 different subspans inside of that with a little bar graph. If you've ever seen it on Chrome browser, you know what that looks like, where it has like all the little time bars. So again, the main thing, all we did here, right, we called this config line, we set up some environment variables which actually communicate with the OpenTelemetry library. Then we call this Microsoft piece, and that piece causes all the Microsoft linkages to happen for the exporters. All it does is create the exporters, which is really cool. So I didn't have to write some code to do the exporters and set the timing. It does this by default. And then we go down here and we create a meter, and then we create as many gauges as we want to measure. And then for each gauge, we actually do set the value. And then for if we want tracing, we create a tracer. And every time we want to trace some trace a transaction, custom trace a transaction, we create a tracing span. And if we want separate timing for any operations inside of that, we just create spans inside of that, and they all get uploaded and show up as a nested set of traces. That's it, man. It is super freaking easy. Oh, and it's all in this library. Have a great day.